Something about the terrifying news story surrounding Julia Trubkina, Brandon Gibbs, and their baby boy Damon does not add up. A dramatic report claims that what started as a cough and fever suddenly became a serious medical emergency, sending Damon to the hospital with breathing problems and leaving Julia and Brandon facing what was described as a long, uncertain recovery. That is frightening enough on its own. But then the story gets incredibly specific: doctors, respiratory support, intensive monitoring, IV treatments, even details about what his recovery supposedly looks like. And that is exactly where we need to slow down, because those details are much harder to independently confirm than the headline makes them sound. What we can confirm is already emotional enough. Julia and Brandon really did struggle on their road to parenthood. Damon really is their first child. Julia really did describe a frightening delivery. And this couple really has spent years fighting over trust, family involvement, fertility, privacy, and one question that keeps returning in different forms: who gets access to their life? That is why this story is much deeper than a scary hospital headline. Because even if we put the newest medical claims aside until stronger confirmation appears, Damon has already changed the most complicated part of Julia and Brandon's marriage. They used to fight about Betty and Ron being too involved. They fought about Julia's parents. They fought about secrets. They fought about fertility. They fought about pregnancy information. Now there is a child sitting right in the middle of that same unresolved dynamic. And suddenly the real question is not just whether Julia and Brandon stay married. It is whether becoming parents will finally force them to create boundaries they never fully learned how to create as husband and wife. But before we get there, we need to separate what sounds dramatic from what is actually established. The new story being circulated describes what supposedly began as a normal seasonal illness. According to that version, Damon developed a cough and fever. His breathing then became more difficult, and Julia and Brandon rushed him to emergency care. From there, the report goes much further, describing specialized pediatric treatment, extensive testing, respiratory assistance, IV therapies, and doctors allegedly preparing the family for a recovery that could take days or even weeks. That is a huge amount of medical detail. And the more detailed a story becomes, the more important one question becomes: where did those details come from? Was Julia quoted directly? Did Brandon publish an update? Did TLC confirm the situation? Did a reputable outlet speak with the family? Was a hospital named? Was a doctor actually quoted? Because there is a massive difference between saying there are reports of a hospitalization and describing exactly what doctors supposedly told the parents behind closed doors. Those are not the same thing. And this is one of the easiest traps in reality TV reporting. A story takes several things that are already true, places an unverified claim in the middle, and suddenly the entire package feels credible, because the audience recognizes the people and their history. Julia and Brandon really did experience a difficult delivery. Their fertility fears were real. Their relationship problems were real. Their conflict with Betty and Ron is not something fans invented. We watched versions of that dynamic play out for years. So when somebody adds a new medical crisis to that history, emotionally it feels possible. It sounds like another painful chapter in a couple that has already been through a lot. But possible is not the same as confirmed. And there is one detail in the circulating story that should immediately make viewers pay closer attention. The report describes Damon as arriving in March 2026. But March was when Julia and Brandon publicly revealed him. They had actually become parents months earlier, in late October 2025. That may sound like a small timeline mistake. It is not, because confusing the public announcement with the actual birth tells us two things. First, basic details in this story can be blurred. And second, Julia and Brandon managed to keep one of the biggest events of their lives private for months. That second part may actually be more important than the hospital rumor. Think about who we are talking about. This is a couple whose relationship has been watched, judged, debated, and pulled apart on reality television for years. Viewers saw Julia come to America. They saw the fights on the farm. They saw Betty and Ron become part of the marriage whether Julia liked it or not. They saw fertility discussions. They saw relationship counseling. They saw painful conversations about trust. There were very few walls around Julia and Brandon's marriage. Then they became parents. And suddenly they built one. They had their son, and the public did not immediately know. That tells me something changed. Maybe they became more protective. Maybe the difficult delivery made them reevaluate what they wanted to share. Maybe years of criticism finally taught them that not every important moment has to belong to television or social media. Maybe it was all of those things. But whatever the reason, Damon appears to represent a line they were willing to draw. And that is fascinating, because Julia and Brandon's entire relationship has basically been one long argument about where the line should be. Go back to the beginning. Julia did not simply move to America to live with Brandon. She moved directly into Brandon's family system. That difference explains so much about everything that came later. She left her country, her parents, her familiar environment, and the life where she had some independence. Then she arrived in Virginia and found herself living inside a household where Brandon's parents already had rules, routines, expectations, opinions, and influence. From Julia's perspective, she probably did not feel like she and Brandon were building their life together. She probably felt like she had been inserted into somebody else's life. And Brandon was caught between those worlds almost immediately. The problem is that Brandon being caught in the middle became almost a permanent personality trait. He often seemed to understand why Julia was upset, but understanding your wife and actually setting a boundary with your parents are two different things. That is where a lot of viewers lost patience with him. Some fans look at Betty and say she is the main problem because she has always been intensely involved in Brandon's life. But another section of the audience sees the situation differently. They argue that Betty can only become that involved if Brandon keeps allowing the marriage to operate with an open door. And I think that distinction is crucial, because if Brandon tells Julia, "I understand why you are upset," but then makes Julia communicate every uncomfortable boundary herself, who becomes the villain? Julia? She becomes the person saying no. She becomes the difficult daughter-in-law. She becomes the woman supposedly trying to pull Brandon away from his family. Meanwhile, Brandon can stand in the middle, looking exhausted, while both sides blame each other. But marriage eventually requires more than understanding everybody. Sometimes you have to own the decision. And fatherhood makes that much more important. Before Damon, a fight with Betty might have been about the house, family visits, privacy, or how often Brandon's parents were involved. Now change the subject from marriage to parenting. Who gets told important information first? Who gets to visit? How much time do grandparents get? Who is allowed to post pictures? What stays private? Who gives parenting advice? And what happens when grandma believes she is helping, but mom feels like she is being overruled? Those issues destroy peace in families that had no previous conflict. Julia and Brandon are walking into them with years of unresolved tension already sitting underneath the surface. That is why I do not buy the idea that having Damon automatically fixes them. A baby can absolutely bring two people closer emotionally, but a baby can also magnify every weakness that was already there. Exhaustion gets worse, money matters more, family becomes more involved. Small decisions feel enormous, and boundaries that used to be optional suddenly become necessary. Julia and Brandon barely figured out the old version of this conflict. Now the stakes are higher. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because Julia cannot be given a free pass on every issue involving privacy and information. If we reduce this relationship to Julia wants healthy boundaries and Betty refuses to respect them, we leave out one of Julia's biggest contradictions. Julia wants control over her own information. Brandon also knows what it feels like when Julia controls information that directly affects him. The clearest example is the revelation involving her ex. Julia admitted that before she came to the United States, she reconnected with an ex-boyfriend and kissed him. For Brandon, the timing was what made that revelation so painful. In his mind, he had been investing in their future while something important was happening that he did not know about, and fans were completely divided over how much weight that kiss deserved. Some viewers felt it was cheating, plain and simple, and believed Brandon had every right to question whether Julia had been honest with him from the beginning. Other viewers thought Brandon reacted as if the kiss had happened yesterday instead of years earlier, and believed the entire situation became bigger than it needed to be. But whatever side you are on, the deeper problem is the same. Brandon believed information had been kept from him. That means this couple's boundary problem does not begin and end with Betty. Both Julia and Brandon have struggled with the same question from different directions. What information belongs to your partner? When does privacy become secrecy? When does independence become exclusion? Julia fights to control her own life. Brandon fights not to be the last person who finds out what is happening inside his marriage. Both needs are understandable. but put them together without strong communication, and they crash into each other. Then, Julia's parents entered the equation, and this exposed another imbalance people sometimes overlook. Brandon had something Julia did not. His family was right there. Sometimes, from Julia's perspective, they were probably way too close, but they were there. Julia's family was thousands of miles away. Imagine that emotionally. You watch your husband argue with his mother, complain about his parents, become frustrated with them, and still have the freedom to see them whenever he wants. Meanwhile, your own parents are living on another continent. That does not automatically make every demand Julia makes reasonable, but it explains why bringing her family closer was never just an immigration issue. For Julia, it was probably about balance. Brandon had spent his entire life surrounded by his support system. Julia gave hers up to enter his. So when Brandon hesitated about bringing her parents closer, Julia may not have heard, "I am worried about money," or "This is complicated." She may have heard something much more emotional. "My family gets to be part of our daily life. Yours does not." And when Betty and Ron expressed opinions about major decisions, Julia may not have heard normal parental concern. She may have heard the same message she had been hearing since her first days on the farm. Brandon's parents still get a vote. Whether that interpretation is always fair is a separate question. Emotionally, though, you can understand where it comes from. Then fertility completely changed the stakes. Brandon wanted to become a father. Julia carried fear and uncertainty around pregnancy and fertility. Now they were no longer arguing about farm chores or family visits. They were talking about the future definition of their marriage. Are we becoming parents? Can we become parents? What happens if we cannot? What happens when one person wants a child more urgently than the other? Those questions can shake extremely stable marriages. Julia and Brandon were asking them inside a relationship that already carried distrust, family tension, cultural displacement, and years of public criticism. And then Damon arrived. That is why the idea that the baby suddenly healed every old problem is far too simple. Damon may be the greatest source of joy they have ever shared. He can still become the biggest test of whether they actually learned anything from their previous conflicts. And fans already seem divided over what healthy boundaries should look like for this family. Some viewers strongly sympathize with Julia. They feel she had to become more aggressive about boundaries because softer approaches never seem to change the dynamic. From that perspective, hiding pregnancy information or controlling who gets access is not Julia being cruel. It is Julia finally protecting a household that belongs to her and Brandon instead of automatically including everyone else. But another part of the audience believes Julia sometimes swings too far in the opposite direction. Those viewers argue that Betty and Ron are not strangers trying to invade the family. They are Brandon's parents and Damon's grandparents. And from that perspective, creating healthy boundaries should not automatically mean keeping them at a distance. I think there is truth on both sides. Julia deserves independence, but boundaries work best when they protect the relationship, not when they become ammunition in another family fight. There is a big difference between Julia saying, "Brandon and I decided this together," and either partner using access, visits, or information to punish somebody else. There is no solid reason to say that is happening now, but the possibility of those old habits returning is exactly why the next phase of this family is so interesting. And then we get to what may be the most important fan argument of all. Maybe everybody spends too much time asking whether Julia or Betty is right. Maybe Brandon is actually the person who decides whether this conflict keeps repeating. Think about it. Betty is responsible for Betty. Julia is responsible for Julia. But Brandon is the bridge between them. He is Betty's son, he is Julia's husband, and now he is Damon's father. Once those three roles collide around one decision, Brandon cannot keep disappearing into the middle. This is where we find out whether he has actually changed. Can Brandon tell his mother no without saying, "Julia does not want this"? Can he disagree with Julia without turning that disagreement into another Julia versus Betty fight? Can he make a decision with his wife and then stand behind it as his own decision? That is the maturity viewers have been waiting to see. Because one of Brandon's biggest problems has never been that he loves his parents. Loving your parents is not a red flag. The problem comes when a married adult tries to avoid disappointing anybody and ends up refusing to establish a clear hierarchy. And Damon changes that hierarchy. Julia and Brandon are no longer simply husband and wife trying to keep two sets of parents happy. They are mom and dad. That has to become the primary team. That does not mean cutting Betty and Ron off. It does not mean Julia gets whatever she wants. It does not mean Brandon stops being somebody's son. It means grandparents become support, not decision makers. And if everybody accepts that, this family could actually become healthier than it has ever been. If they do not, the same old drama may return with much higher stakes. Now imagine Betty gives parenting advice Julia did not ask for. Imagine Brandon privately agrees with his mother, then avoids telling Julia. Imagine Julia reacts by limiting access. Imagine Brandon thinks she has gone too far. Imagine Julia wants Damon to spend more time with her side of the family, and Brandon starts worrying about money, travel, distance, or logistics. None of those are confirmed future storylines, but none of them would come out of nowhere either. They all grow directly from problems we have already watched this couple struggle with. That is why parenthood will be the real test of whether therapy and recommitment changed anything. It is relatively easy to sit in a controlled environment and promise better communication. It is much harder when both of you are exhausted, the baby is crying at 3 a.m, somebody's mother is calling with advice, and neither partner has the patience left to communicate perfectly. That is where old habits come back. And here is another change I would watch closely. Julia may become much more private from this point forward. Keeping Damon's birth out of the public eye for months suggests her relationship with fame may already be changing. Julia knows what happens when strangers dissect your marriage. She knows how quickly viewers choose sides. She knows how one emotional comment can become a headline. But Damon cannot choose any of that. He cannot decide whether he wants his childhood debated on Reddit. He cannot decide whether he wants his health discussed on YouTube. He cannot decide whether a private family moment becomes public content. That responsibility belongs to Julia and Brandon. And this is where reality TV itself creates an uncomfortable contradiction. Julia and Brandon are public figures. Their audience exists because people became invested in their lives. Viewers followed their relationship for years. So where does that relationship with the audience stop? If you share the pregnancy, does the audience feel entitled to the birth? If you reveal the baby, do viewers expect every health update? If you share family photographs, does every missing post suddenly become evidence of a crisis? That is modern reality TV. People do not just watch an episode and go home anymore. They check Instagram. They watch TikTok. They read Reddit threads. They compare dates. They watch who follows whom. They notice deleted pictures. They study captions like detectives. And eventually, some viewers forget something important. Access is something the cast chooses to give. It is not something the audience owns. That is why the current hospital story deserves caution. If Julia and Brandon have not publicly explained a medical situation in detail, nobody should fill that silence with specific diagnoses, treatment plans, or supposed conversations with doctors, and then present those details as confirmed. You can say claims are circulating, you can investigate the source, you can talk about why the story is spreading, you can ask what has actually been confirmed. But once somebody starts speaking confidently about specialists, medical treatments, and a child's prognosis without a clear direct source, we have moved far beyond normal commentary. And the strange thing is, Julia and Brandon do not need an exaggerated story to be interesting. Their actual history is dramatic enough. They went from the farm conflict to marriage problems. They survived the revelation involving Julia's ex. They fought over family. They struggled with fertility. There were moments when viewers genuinely questioned whether the relationship could survive. And then they became parents. That is already a massive character arc, which brings us to the biggest question of all. Will Damon become the reason Julia and Brandon finally mature as a couple? Or will parenthood expose every weakness they managed to avoid dealing with before? Because babies do not just bring love into a household, they expose systems. Who handles pressure? Who shuts down? Who takes control? Who wants help? Who hates asking for help? Who calls the grandparents first? Who feels criticized by parenting advice? Who feels excluded? And when everybody disagrees, who actually gets the final say? Brandon may be heading toward the biggest character test he has faced since we first met him. For years, fans joked about him being trapped between his wife and his mother. That dynamic becomes much less funny when a child is involved. Damon cannot be raised by committee. And fatherhood may finally force Brandon to say something viewers have wanted to hear for years. Not, Julia wants more space, but this is what I decided with my wife. Those two sentences sound similar. Psychologically, they are completely different. The first makes Julia responsible for upsetting Betty. The second makes Brandon responsible for protecting his own household. That is the growth. If Brandon makes that shift, Betty might disagree, but at least everyone knows where the boundary actually is. If he does not, Julia may become even more defensive. And then the family falls right back into the same cycle. Julia expects Betty to overstep, so Julia becomes more protective. Betty senses Julia pulling away, so Betty tries harder to stay involved. Brandon hates confrontation, so he avoids making a firm decision. Julia interprets his silence as choosing his mother. Betty interprets his silence as permission. Everybody gets angrier, and nothing changes. That cycle can survive for decades. But parenthood can also be the reason people finally break patterns that marriage alone could not break. Brandon now has something bigger than keeping everybody comfortable. Julia has something bigger than proving she can protect herself. They both have a son who needs stability. That could change everything. And this is also where we need to resist another reality TV habit. Not every disagreement means divorce. Reality television trains people to see collapse everywhere. A couple fights, marriage over. A spouse disappears from Instagram, separation, somebody deletes a picture, divorce announcement incoming. A family member argues with another family member, somebody is getting cut off forever. Real relationships do not always work like that. Julia and Brandon have already survived major conflicts. The ex-revelation hurt Brandon. Their disagreements about starting a family were serious. Julia wanting her parents closer created real tension. The fertility question touched something much deeper than ordinary reality TV drama. And yet, they remained together. They became parents. That does not erase the red flags, but it does mean there is evidence of resilience too. So I do not think the most interesting prediction is, will they break up? The stronger question is, can they adjust? Because they are no longer the same couple. They are a different family now. Their marriage used to be the center of every conflict. Parenting may become the center of the next phase. And strong couples are not necessarily couples who stop arguing. Usually they are couples who finally understand what they are actually arguing about. For Julia and Brandon, the surface issue keeps changing. At one point it was the farm. Then Betty. Then privacy. Then Julia's ex. Then her parents. Then fertility. Then pregnancy. Now parenthood. But underneath almost every version of the conflict is the same deeper question. Who gets a voice in this relationship? Who gets told what? Who gets included? Who gets protected? And when two families want different things, who comes first? Damon makes the answer much more important. That is why I would not look at these current rumors and immediately ask whether this is simply the next tragedy in Julia and Brandon's story. I would ask what happens when a couple that has always struggled over control suddenly has a child depending on them to make decisions together. Because if Damon ever does face a serious health situation, and I want to be very clear that I am not saying the current hospitalization claims are confirmed, that would put enormous pressure on any marriage. People respond differently to fear. One parent might become incredibly focused and practical. The other might fall apart emotionally. One might want grandparents nearby. The other might want complete privacy. One might feel comforted by sharing updates. The other might feel violated by it. None of that means the parents do not love each other. But those differences become intense when everyone is scared. And Julia and Brandon already have a history where information, privacy, and family access are sensitive subjects. So if a genuine health update eventually comes directly from them, one of the most revealing things may not even be what happened medically. It may be how they handle the information. Do they share everything? Do they protect most of it? Does Betty become more involved? Does Julia welcome that support? Or immediately become guarded? Does Brandon finally take the lead instead of standing between both sides? Those decisions would tell us a lot about whether this family has actually changed. Until stronger confirmation comes out though, the responsible position is pretty simple. Damon is real. His difficult birth is part of Julia and Brandon's documented story. Their long road to parenthood is real. Their history of conflict with family and boundaries is real. And their decision to keep Damon's birth private for months is extremely important. But the specific claim that he is currently hospitalized in critical condition should not be repeated as established fact without stronger confirmation. And strangely, that uncertainty does not make Julia and Brandon's story less interesting. It actually clears away the noise. Because their biggest challenge may not be another cheating confession, another explosive argument, or another moment designed for reality television. It may be learning how to become a family when everyone around them wants some level of access. Their parents want access. Reality television wants access. Fans want access. Social media rewards access. And Julia and Brandon have to decide where that access stops. They spent years trying to become a functional husband and wife. Now they have to become mom and dad without carrying every old conflict into their child's life. Julia has to figure out the difference between protecting her family and automatically assuming involvement equals interference. Brandon has to figure out the difference between loving his parents and allowing them too much influence over decisions that belong to him and his wife. Betty and Ron may have to accept that becoming grandparents does not automatically mean becoming part of every parenting decision. And viewers may have to accept something too. Being invested in a reality star's life does not mean we are entitled to every private detail about their child. That may end up being the biggest boundary in Julia and Brandon's story. And the answer could tell us more about their future than almost anything we saw during their previous relationship crises. If Julia and Brandon finally create a real, united front, parenthood could actually stabilize them. Brandon could finally learn to establish limits without blaming Julia for them. Julia could finally feel secure enough that she does not have to enter every family disagreement already prepared for battle. And Betty and Ron could become supportive grandparents without feeling like they need influence over every decision. But if Brandon continues trying to please everyone, and Julia continues expecting every disagreement to turn into another invasion of her independence, then parenthood will not erase their old problems. It will expose them. Not because Damon causes conflict, because raising a child makes avoiding unresolved conflict much harder. And that is why this story is bigger than one dramatic headline. Julia and Brandon spent years fighting over who controlled their relationship. Now they have something much more important than the marriage itself to protect. Their son. So while everybody is focused on asking what exactly is happening with Damon right now, I think there is another question that may define Julia and Brandon's entire next chapter. Will becoming parents finally force them to stop operating as Julia versus Betty with Brandon trapped somewhere in the middle? Or will the same family conflicts that followed their marriage for years become even more intense now that there is a child involved? And if you have watched Julia and Brandon from the beginning, I really want to know where you stand. Do you think fatherhood will finally push Brandon to create stronger boundaries with Betty and Ron and put Julia and Damon first as his immediate family? Or do you think Julia's need for control and Brandon's fear of disappointing his parents will eventually recreate the exact same conflict they have been having all along?